Very few people fill this place, so we're proud to have you. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague Siba Grovogui as part of our new conversation series, which is meant to address a work in progress, normally by a Cornell-based colleague. So this is an open invitation to many of you who has any new work that you want to share or manuscript that you want to workshop. We'll be happy. We normally ask a person to invite colleagues who are familiar with the work. So in this case, I guess Siba did a great job in getting so many people with so many competing events. So Siba's talk today is based on an introductory chapter related to his current book project, International Relation, a genealogy of present and a history of the future, which is, from what I understand, is near completion. Siba is a professor of international relations and political theory at Africana Studies, originally from Guinea, and to distinguish it properly, is Guinea-Conakry.
Thank you.
Siba received a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 1988, prior to joining Cornell Africana Studies. Siba was a professor of international relations and theory and law at the Johns Hopkins University. Getting to know Siba's work more closely as a colleague, I can say with confidence that he is among the leading scholars of his generation in the field of political science, political thought, and international relations, and more specifically those who work at the intersection of international relations and law, and African political thought and African intellectual history. In other words, Siba is a true multidisciplinarian and conversant in a wide range of fields. Formerly a judge, which is very few people know this, and a prominent judge actually in Guinea, and a lawyer himself in his home country, Guinea-Conakry. Siba has a deep knowledge of the working of law, which he combines with a profound mastery of political theory and a deep commitment to African social and political thought, which further sets him apart from most of his colleagues in his field of interest. On surveying Grovogui's published work, one is struck by the sheer quantity of his scholarly output. However, more than the quantity of his scholarship, it is its uniformly high quality that had made his contributions more influential. He is the author of several books, and I just mentioned a few: Sovereign, Quasi-Sovereign, and Africans. Sorry, Race and Self-Determination in International Law, published by University of Minnesota Press, and Beyond Eurocentrism and Anarchy, Memories of International Institutions and Order. Grovogui is currently, or Siba, as I would like to call him, currently completing 2 manuscripts under the rubric of Future Anterior. One is International Relations, that I mentioned, the genealogy of the genealogy of the present, a history of the future, and the First Republic, Palmares, Haiti, and the Question of the Human. So in addition, Siba had published a remarkable number of book chapters and articles in peer-reviewed journals, in addition to essays in other types of publications and platforms. Siba has so many awards and grants and honors to his credit, including a long-term grant from the National Science Foundation and National Health Institute, among many others, which cannot be mentioned due, of course, limitations of time. So without further ado, I would like to to ask you to join me in welcoming, Siba.
Thank you all for coming. I don't know what to say really. I almost fainted when I saw the crowd because I was imagining only a few people to help me think through the project. A project that I've been thinking about for a while, and I had been thinking about it in a particular way when I was at Johns Hopkins, but my coming to Cornell sort of changed it. When I came to Cornell, I actually came with 1 book project, and when I came to Cornell, it became 2. Before I came to Cornell, it was 1 book project, when I actually got it became 2. And that's what Salah was talking about future anterior. And it became, when I started the book, it actually, the big project was, I called it my Haiti book because it was about Haiti, it was about civil rights, it was about genealogy of civil rights. Because I had always understood that, our history of human rights, constitutional law, was somewhere slightly jaundiced. And so I wanted to do this stuff on Haiti, and that's how it started. And then, of course, when I started it, people in my field were talking about first generation rights, second generation human rights, third generation human rights, which I thought was actually bunk. And I'm putting it kindly, because there was no such a thing. But then we shifted to humanitarian law, humanitarianism, and then we had the International Criminal Court, so I became more ambitious along the way. And then when I came to Cornell, I decided that, in fact, there had to be, I shouldn't just be critiquing, there has to be a space beyond critique. And this idea of having a space beyond critique was actually, became available to me, the language for it only when I came to Cornell. I decided that I didn't want to be correcting everybody's paper, I should write mine. And that's basically where I am. And I'm this place because I actually had already, like most people, though I'm not the biggest of them, but I had already thought that we live through a crisis of society, of institution, of norms, and etc. And Africa, for me, is actually the place where I see it. Because all the solutions that applied to Africa, to the crisis in Africa, seem to be taken from times that really no longer apply to the general conditions of Africa. And so that's one problem. The other part actually is that our disciplines, or the way in which we talk about Africa, are actually sometimes very disheartening. And for me, the crisis in Libya actually brought that to the fore. Because when the crisis in Libya happened, the only thing people could say about Africa, even smart people, was that Africans wanted a negotiated peace in Libya because Gaddafi had given them money, because. Obviously, Africans can't imagine the universal. They can only think through their own places and through the umbilical, right, the stomach. But the tragedy of that, of course, is that Africa had developed over 30 years very significant norms about conflict resolution. You only have to read Cabral, if people cared, to know that our struggle against colonialism was never about white or colonialist per se, that's Cabral. That the struggle against colonialism was against colonialism, but not colonialist, because at the end of colonialism, everybody becomes citizen. So the idea of sort of vanquishing your enemy in certain ways, in the way that people imagine them in Libya, actually went against 30 years of traditions of thinking about conflict in Africa. But nobody paid attention to what Africans had done or thought over 30 years. All they could imagine was that if they said, let's negotiate Libya, it means that they want us to support Gaddafi. Which for me, told me, it's the only crisis about which I wrote 5 op-ed pages, 5 blog articles, because it told me that it's very difficult for people to imagine that Africans can think the universal. That the universal can only be thought somewhere else, and Africans cannot and have not. So that's the general background, actually, that's the mood in which I found myself when I was thinking about this project. The particular institutional reflex actually have to come with the idea of Africana. Africana, and that's my second point, Africana, and the idea of Africana, for me, suggests multiple things. One of which is at least that ethnic studies programs and programs like Africana were conceived because we thought that certain concerns, certain subjects, certain spaces had not been sufficiently studied in our disciplines, and therefore we needed to give them the space to at least enrich our debate, disciplinary debates at some level. But it also meant for people who are in those spaces like me, that one of the tasks perhaps we didn't need to do is to be answerable to our subject. And for me, when I think about my subject, the people I'm studying, generations of Africans from anti-slavers in Palmares, in Brazil, to anti-colonial, to Haiti, to anti-colonials to today, had never been able to conceive of the struggle for freedom without the universal. Or I should say, the ones I'm interested in could only think about the universal freedom in the context of universal categories. But it's a different way of thinking the universal, and which is what is at stake for me. It's a different way of thinking the universal. But it wasn't just, as people imagine, to be derivative of European discourses, which is how we pretend it, which is what we think it is, which is not. And so what then happens is that all of those figures in African struggle for freedom have been sort of localized in many ways. Martin Luther King is an American actor whose debate were about the American Constitution, even though he said stuff about Vietnam War, the world was in his background of what he was doing, violence generally, nuclear weapons, and etc. But he's an American. Du Bois also, right? Wezem Coulibaly is in Africa. All of those people are sort of localized, and so as an Africanist, I actually decided that maybe I should try again to go back to the debate they were engaged in, because many of them had imagined that the world will not function properly, that our institution will collapse, that democracy could not work in the way we conceived it, that market and the space and how they structure spaces could not function properly, and etc. etc. So that critique, which happened a long time ago, actually should be sort of should be something. At least at minimum there is something in it, right? But all of them seem to disappear with time, and so this project for me was about bringing them together. But I couldn't do it because, and so that's the second comment. Now, methodologically, which is what the two chapters I want to talk about today have to do with method. I couldn't do it without actually thinking about method. And for me, as a post-colonial scholar, I had decided about 3 years ago that I was tired of just saying what is wrong with what people do, or what wrong people have done to us, but not, right? What wrong people have done to us, race, racial discrimination, etc., etc. So I decided to do something totally different. And the different part had to do, for me, with asking myself the question about what became of Africans in our modern discourses, whether Africa has ever been absent from this human trajectory we call modernity. Right? And I couldn't find any place to go without first looking at archives. And so my project began as an archival project. I wanted to know how archives were assembled. And then from archives, I went to canons. And from canons, I went to the algorithms upon which our archives are based. And then, so that's the story. So the first two chapters I'm going to talk about today are about two things. One is about archives, and one is about the algorithm upon which they are based, which has to do with the narratives, how we have interpreted the narratives of international relations, and etc., etc. And I'm actually, you can see I'm very nervous because I actually did not expect you all to be here, but thank you very much. I'll try. I will try. International relations is, of course, in the social sciences, one of the newest disciplines. And which for me is both unfortunate and fortunate for what I want to do. But I decided that in fact the newness of it is very interesting. Because international relations as a social science should have been able to dispense with a lot of things in the social sciences that have to do with how we understand the world, that it did not. In fact, it took most of the worst attributes of all the social sciences and put them together to give us a narrative about the world. No. And I'm not joking here. International relations has something it shares only with anthropology, which is that it actually has a universal predicate. Anthropology was about the human. International relations was about relations among those humans. It was not knowing humans in their custom, in their traditions, etc., but in knowing how they relate. How that story could be told in a very Eurocentric way is actually very disturbing. Not only because what intimates about the human and what has become the human in the manner in which the discipline treats the globe, but also how how unfortunate it is that all of the findings that we know today that have happened in history about historiography, in philosophy and literature, in hermeneutics, and elsewhere about ethnography and etc., how all of them seem to have bypassed international relations. Right? Because none of the stuff we say actually has anything about that we know today. It's just a question of what we know, knowledge generally speaking. And so that's really where I started. And when I started looking at it, I said, but international relations are actually not alone. It is, all of the social sciences have done something of the sort from the beginning. And so, could you tell me how you do this, please?
Oh, sure. It should just advance.
I don't do
Let's
Apple.
see.
Yeah.
So just arrow keys.
All of this stuff don't make sense for two people who are here, but I just wanted to talk about, to make certain kind of distinction about practice. What scholars in international relations want to do, which is really about aggregate phenomenon, event relationship that constitute what we call international relations. What do international relations scholars do? The anthropology of the discipline, and our own identity as people who practice, who do this discipline. And the way I imagined it was actually go to certain classical texts. One of them, from Stanley Hoffman to Martin White, about why is it that international relations is just a bad shape, why we don't know, etc., etc. So there's a lot of question in international relations itself about why we have not been able, why we have not been able to come up with a very good theory of international relations. For some of them, it's really about whether international relations as a discipline is capable of doing what it pretends to accomplish, because it has this universal pretension, but it is basically confined to certain narratives. And this is just me and the French in me, and etc., in machine and la science. So I decided to think about what has happened in science. And the way I imagined it was actually to go back to the resistance in international relations today to anything that is new, anything that is not of Eurocentric sort, right? All of our critique, post-colonial critique of institutions, including democracy, of market, of state, all of them always run up against something. And the language is always, if you say, this happened in Africa or China that year, they will say that's nostalgia, right? If you say, but the world can be done this way, somebody will say, but that's utopia. So I started seeing, and so international relations is predicated on this idea of realism. Even people who call themselves liberals have this idea of the real, and I wanted to see the real. And what astounded me when I went to the archives is that, in fact, nostalgia and utopia had been the two founding legs of the modern age. The Renaissance, the ethos of the Renaissance was nostalgia. It was going back to Rome and to the Greeks. Right? So basically what we have in the disciplines today is competing nostalgia. Some are good, some are bad. But nobody actually tells me why my nostalgias are bad and why theirs is actually good. Because we went to Rome and etc. And I'm going to say why that is. But somehow, if I say China, people imagine that I want to talk about China of the Communist Party today. But when I talk about the Silk Road, I'm actually talking a different kind of China. It's not a vindication of the Chinese Communist Party. It is a historical entity called China. Right? You cannot conceive of markets today in the world as they are. Even the instrument of global capital did not start in Europe. So that whole world system theory stuff about capitalism is rising, etc., is actually not funded at multiple levels, is actually erroneous. Right? But every time I started talking about the world in that way, somebody said, but that's so nostalgic. Do you think that can happen again? And then I started asking myself, but what is the Renaissance? What's a fit of nostalgia? Right? And nostalgia, the function of nostalgia therefore started interesting me because nostalgia has a function. It's at minimum comparative. At minimum, we are in this predicament. People over there and in those times seem to have seen it in that way. Right? And the other side of that, of course, is this idea of utopia. The idea that utopia was actually a bad thing also came about in a particular sequence of events, and which is what I want to talk about, and which is also what I'm running up against. And so, you can see, and I just have to lay the card, my card on the table here, that at the end of these chapters, I actually want to defend both nostalgia and utopia, but different sorts of, and etc. Right? But this also was built on these. And all you have here, of course, humanity and etc. And I'm going to be talking later about how it was possible to conceive of these terms and what happened in these particular years, what was happening in Europe, what was happening in the sciences, in hard sciences, and what made it possible for us to think about the world as united in the manner that we did. Because that also is in part of the history. And I'm saying all of those things actually, both as a critique and a revision, etc., but also as a way of saying that, in fact, a lot of things we talk about in post-colonial analysis are not different from this, except that we seem to, and the exceptions are what I want to talk about later. This is the thing. Basically, I was talking about nostalgia and utopia, and I want to actually talk about nostalgia and utopia in the relationship to disciplines and how they structured them in some fashion. Of course, when I looked at all of the disciplines, the field that mattered to my discipline in international relations is what at stake here. I'm using that, there's a larger allegory for the social sciences, but I want to start with international relations. But we talk about international relations about proof, evidence, and fact usually. And what I tried to do going through the archives was actually to see both when they came about and what was happening. What I can say for sure at this moment is that prior to the Renaissance, the fields, generally speaking, were very integrative. Mathematics, philosophy, philology, even anthropology before the Enlightenment, all of them did something about units. And if you look at most of the philosophers, many of whom were also mathematicians, you can actually see the influence of integrals. Right? Everything proceeded from units, and how units broke up, and how new units were formed, and etc. But what happens, obviously, after the Renaissance, during the Enlightenment, is that differentials took over. From that, and we proceeded differently. And how archives have constituted facts, which is really at stake here, what has become facts, the facts that we believe are facts about the world today, how we came to believe this, how we came to justify them, evidence, and how we actually prove that those justifications are valid, right? Proofs. All of them came into being into the disciplines in a particular fashion at different moment, right? Such that after the Enlightenment, when we have the science of politics, the science of economy, the science of philology, the science of natural history, and etc., in between, it's not just that in the sciences some things were happening, like empiricism and how empiricism colored how we saw this, but it is also that by this time, conquest was already underway, right? And how conquest, the new world, shaped how empiricism became part of our discourses of politics, economy, philology, and natural history is also for me a very interesting part of this discussion, because I wanted to understand how the disciplines came to be so certain about their own foundation, their own empirical foundation. Because most of it is actually very shaky. And it's shaky in part because, it's shaky in part because we seem to lose, and I'm going to go back to when I talk about algorithm, that we seem to lose integrals for differentials, but even differentials work differently in the social sciences than they did in mathematics. And that actually was very deliberate. And the deliberateness has to do, obviously, with the fact that there was a common sense that began to emanate alongside these, right? That common sense was not as common as we imagine. In fact, Descartes did say that common sense is not as common as we imagine. And that's why we need rules and procedures and methods and etc. so that we can guide people to common sense, because it's not as common, right? And so what is happening, how our disciplinary common sense become established about the economy, about Malthusianism, how that becomes something you can actually justify, how Locke can talk about government and etc., how the human begin to emerge in our discourses, how we come to imagine certain institutions are not valid and more valid than others, and etc., had nothing to do with the fact that they actually worked. In effect, which has to do with evidence, that facts were being constituted in the discipline without evidence at all. Right? But what mattered was the common sense that was driving them actually is much more important than the facts themselves. Right? And my friend who's sitting in the back there, Femi, has a word for it. There was, since I was talking about differentials, a metaphysics of difference. Things that happen over there have to be different. And technology didn't work anymore. We are not together. The humans don't function. Even though, as I was talking about humanity back, I don't know how this works, I will go back to humanity. The idea of humanity came about because at some point, biology told us that humans were all the same everywhere. So human capacity and human faculties had to function in the same way. If they function in the same way, they can be applied in the same way. And so what matters, if you wanted to see how the operation of differentiation, how people thought, you had to imagine that the manner in which they articulated things may differ, but when things are parallel, probably the justification might be somewhere approximate. And so you cannot imagine the human as being different. And so Locke's state of nature was actually somewhat of a fraud at that level, given the state of the sciences. Right? You had to imagine the nature. But the common sense only had to do with the fact that Europe would not accept that people whose land it was taking actually had a relationship to nature, which may be constitutive, maybe not property, I would imagine it, but that it mattered to them, that those relationships to nature mattered to them in the manner that property mattered to Europeans. Right? So because we could not justify that, we could not understand that, we actually had to imagine them to be different, and the institutions to be different, and the rationality of those institutions to be different. And so basically, what I was going to understand was how all of these entities figured in the way in which disciplines were constituted themselves, and I'm talking about discipline of international relations, so Locke, Hobbes, Hume, Baudin, Machiavelli, all of them are implicated here. And certainly those ones that start speculating about the world after the concept of state of nature came about, and after conquest, the conquest began. And so I wanted to do that. Right? So common sense, you can see common sense and reason come back to back because at some point, common sense, somebody has to justify common sense. And the reason that we have to understand common sense is that we had to understand common sense. Common sense has to prevail because it had to be backed up by something. And reason became the one we went to. And reason obviously could not be possible if fantasy, utopia, all of those have not begun to take on other colors. And when people who were not supposed to be reasonable were either insane, lunatic, mad, had unreason, blah, 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 etc. Right? And I'm actually, again, this is really, this is massive amount of bibliography, right? These are in the thousands, but I actually wanted to quote all of them. I was obsessed with it because I want to be able, in this book, to do that so that when I write about the First Republic, Palmares, then nobody has to ask me those questions. Right? And so I just have to get that out of my system to show that, in fact, reason, common sense, the disciplines, canons, all of them are implicated in a particular project. It's not that the particular, and so I don't have a problem with Plato, Aristotle. I do have a problem with Aristotelians after conquest, right? And I have a problem with Kant, which is very distant from the problem I have with Kantians afterward, and etc. And I wanted to make that sure. But how the canons were meant to enter these spaces about how the archives were constituted, that justificatory movement is also very important to me because I wanted to see what happens there and how these people came to justify this. How could Aristotle or Plato be said to justify what we were doing after the Enlightenment? It becomes important to me, right? And so that's actually the first chapter, and that's why I left it. But before I go, I want to say a few things. I do understand that when we talk about archives, we actually talk about management of knowledge, right? I do understand the knowledge is fragmented, and we have to make it cohesive at some level. I do understand that. I don't understand why when you go to the library here, everything that has to do with Africa, whether it's science, philosophy, and etc., is under DT. Right? No, it's not funny. I'm sorry. It's funny, but it's not funny. I know. But it's under DT. But that's actually how things are set. right? Because you cannot place African philosophy in those sections of philosophy because they actually, Africans are contemporaneously talking to those people who are talking about them. Right? So those discussions, the archives actually don't allow you those kind of discussion. Right? Because you have already placed everything that matters about Africa in DT. So, the fact that I recognize fragmentation, I recognize the necessity to manage, but how the cohesion happened and what was conjured up at the moment of assembly of archives actually matters to me. And I wanted to do a very serious work of showing how you do that, how we came to have DT, where you put, and if you're Native Americans, you have a section where you put all of them. Shamanism, medicine, even those people who help us break codes during World War II, we put them in that section, not in the section of people who are capable of empathy vis-a-vis people who colonized and murdered them. Right? So that doesn't enter into a discussion of humanism. That is something else. They were loyal Americans. Or they were acting at that moment, right? But that actually is a serious subject of discussion at some level, that Native Americans were the ones who allowed us to have codes that were impenetrable to other people and help us win a war. But that too goes in that section where we call natives, right? Because it doesn't enter into our consideration of humanitarian or humanism. It can go there. And for me, that actually mattered. And you can see that I have a bunch of names here, and those are there for very good reason. I can bore you with them. I'll go to them later. But I just wanted to say that the way the archives are constituted actually doesn't make sense. And so, I actually, in thinking about what was being conjured up, I actually had to go back to how integration happened in archives and what sections are in the archives and why they are considered in the same way. So I had to actually see how things are differentiated, how equivalencies are made, along what line we divide things, and the kind of algorithms that dictate what kind of patterns we give archives to give to our archives. By which I do not just mean library, I mean how we understand the world generally, right? How it appears in canons and etc. Right? And the networks of scholars that make those things happen also matter to me, which is why I said it's very massive, because everybody from Francis Bacon, to Henry Kissinger is there. Right? And I actually wanted to do that because it's actually important to me to make later argument. And of course, the point of all of this discussion was to think about how we might think about new sets of archives, because the old ones actually are not operative, at least they are funded on a logic that can no longer hold. And this is where I started thinking about algorithms, because people, if you think of the encyclopedia, Diderot, Cosmos, help me. Cosmos. Humboldt, right? You are supposed to be my resident memory. Humboldt, and etc. You actually see that they were very, very precise that how they were imagining the world and the world of knowledge and the world of nature was actually mirrored one another in a very precise sort of way, which is why it's not a mistake that Humboldt in particular called his project Cosmos. The encyclopedia of Diderot was also in the same vein. So I wanted to actually see what algorithms do, right? The distributive function, integrative function, comparative function, and predictive function. All of them have those functions have either logic in them or an algorithm underneath them. And I didn't want to go for logic because logic for me has been overdone. So I wanted to actually see distribution patterns, etc., integrals, differentials, and the algebraic function of how we reason, how we work with archives, and etc. And that's what this is about. But in international theory, for instance, international relations, it has 4 general fields. Well, we have international theory, we have international politics, we have international law, and we have international ethics. And if you can actually see, there's a very precise, other way of thinking of distribution. You can find there's a very precise way in which these are assembled here. International theory actually is both distributive and comparative. International politics is functions 1 and 4. And you can see this, and I did that because I wanted to help myself track what political theory is doing, what comparative politics is doing, what international law is doing, right? And I wanted to track them because I wanted to talk about certain conceptions. For instance, in international law, the question of the human. What is international, what is human? And so I wanted to do that. And of course, what occurred to me as I was looking, this is actually, this is an illustration of what I was talking about earlier, right? In all archives, some things are very simple. Epic event, West. Great men, West. Reason, West. Civilization, West. Destiny, West. Fate, over there. Purpose of the event, yeah, they have event that makes sense, right? You have Sitting Bull, you have this, you have that. You go to any continent, you find them, right? There are impassioned men who had causes, whatever, but those passions do not translate into reason. That simply is not, there's no reason there. And I was just, this is just something I can just put all of their books here and just go through them, right? So, extraordinary, yes, over here. Predictable trajectory over here. We actually know where the West is going. These other people we don't. Unchanging, maybe reactionary even. Ordinary, yes. Impassioned, yes. Mostly degenerate, because if the West did not come, they will go, right? You now have this new wave of people trying to justify colonialism. What will happen after we didn't show up? Right? There's even Third World Quarterly just published an essay on, right? Justifying colonialism. So that's one of my, I just wanted to say, and this thing, right? The reason I actually put these here have to do with particular events. When we shift from that to this, to the idea that there was something called genus, and what kind of taxonomy we got from that, and differentials, and what other people are, the manner in which other people differ. I actually wanted to do that because that's actually very essential to the way we think about power today, right? We justify, just think of North Korea. North Korea cannot have this because we can't trust them with nuclear weapons. Now, which is the only country that ever used nuclear weapons? I don't know. That's the case, right? But it's just reflex. Reflexively, they cannot be trusted. Somebody, but we can, right? And we can is actually, that too is one of my illustrations, right? Why do we trust the West with deadly weapons and other people not? Because of what I said here. They only have passion, they don't have reason. The way it worked out after the 17th century, two things. If salvation be the end of it, no amount of violence can be spared to save them. So we can drop the bombs there, we can drop the mother of all bombs, many of them can die by the thousands, but the end with salvation, that's okay because hell is worse. The other one is that in the West we actually imagine that because we can deliberate, if we can define our interests reasonably, then we can fight our wars passionately, that's okay. Other people may not fight wars passionately because they cannot argue their interests reasonably. 17th century, you can just see Baudin, all of them. You can just go through them, right? And so these functions actually matters, and this is about computation, it doesn't matter really, really, really. And this is the language of the discipline, and that's, I'm just going to go through them now. Now, this is the thing. I actually was interested in finding out when people began to associate utopia and nostalgia with what had preceded them, the apocalypse or fantasy, right? Because fantasy and utopia are not one and the same thing. And that obviously is one of my goals here. So I just wanted to do that rapidly, and now I'm going to go give you 5 minutes stuff, and I actually want to get you to ask me questions because I'm writing. The back end of the book is completely written. It was a seminar at Hopkins I was teaching, and that's written. And these are the two chapters I'm working on. One is on archives, one is on the algorithm through which we think about the world. And I actually wanted people, because you are from many disciplines, I wanted people to both direct their questions at me as either as comment or as challenge or whatever, because I actually need to think about them. But what I don't want to let go is the idea that we cannot either reconfigure disciplines, which we can, and they must, that our archives have to stay the same because they can't. In fact, they have never been. We have a grand illusions about what our archives do for us, and they are becoming more and more irrelevant. Just look at fake news. around us, right? Nobody believes anything anymore. We also have to actually have faith in the future in certain ways. The reason I call this a history of the future is that I actually imagine the moment in which we are both as a cross between the moment of institutional collapse that gave rise to the Renaissance and the one that gave rise to the Enlightenment. At this point, we actually need serious rethinking of our fields of knowledge itself, and our institutions. And everybody who says that we shouldn't do that because that's utopia, either doesn't know about utopia or is fundamentally reactionary. That's actually one of the arguments I make. Because it's a reactionary move. It's no different from the Whigs, and before them, those people who resisted the Enlightenment in Europe at the time. Because we have to. Everything has to be recast. And it's that reformulation that I want to do, and I actually want to do, in my case, with the voices of Africans through modernity, whose comment about events that were happening I take to be a critique of modernity itself that can give rise to new ways of thinking. And of course, after this book, the next chapter is going to be what I call the New Republic. And yes, I'm going to argue that the first republic in the New World was Palmares. And the only reason people cannot bring themselves to think of it as a republic is that nobody wants to allow themselves to think that if Africans say, we take these truths, if black people say we take these truths to be evident, self-evident, blah, 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 that they sever the relationship to the colonial power, etc., we do not accept that to be a valid expression of the will. Palmares existed as a republic much longer than the Soviet Union. It had treaties with European countries, but we still think of it as a renegade slave colony, right? Because we privilege Portugal's claim over Palmares, over the will of the people who live in Palmares, however way they may have organized them, however many treaties they passed, however constitutional form they had, we can't allow ourselves to think. And for me, that's one of the ways of going back and reconstructing our archives. That, my friends, was first, the first republic in the New World, and secondly, all our histories of modern history of civil rights, not civil liberties, civil rights can be traced from Palmares to anti-colonialism, which is why we think of Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, Harriet Tubman, and all those in the context of civil rights. And the relationship between black struggles and the construction of public space, and etc., which is why you hear the word republic. But I actually want to make that because I actually want to contest the ground upon which we have taught people over civil rights and civil liberties, because we need to go to do that to actually be able to reimagine what can be done next. But I want to claim first Palmares as the first republic in the New World. And that's my project. And so in that context, I don't know if you see the relationship between this first part and the second part, but I really just want to hear your comment. And I made it very cryptic, very vast, but I want to hear your comments, and I need help. Voilà. Merci.
Thank you so much. Do you want to handle the questions yourself?
I was expecting you to protect me against eggs being thrown at me. No. Yes, I'll handle the questions. Yes, I'll do that. Please, I know that I was going too fast and I may be able to clarify. Please ask me. Yes?
So, thank you. I really appreciate your project. I had one question of the way that you divide West and the rest in these two sets of characteristics. Because when you were explaining, my first thought was that's also kind of masculinizing and feminizing. But then my next thought was this is about artificiality and technique, and this is about nature. And I think that also kind of makes this division legible. And I was thinking of how do you think of the obsession that you were talking about in the beginning of international relations with the real within the West, as opposed to these categories of nature. And I guess my thought was the division of the artificial and the natural in between late medieval and early Renaissance, and what is happening with these divisions and how the world is being divided. And if maybe you can talk about that, or if that.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, two quick comments. First, when I write, I actually never talk about, I talk about the West, I write about within and without. And I prefer that because it's not West and other, because even within the West there are people who are not terribly off that. There's that. The other part is that there are many spaces claimed as the West, Spain, and etc., which is that's a very difficult thing too. So I actually try to use different language because I don't buy into that, right? I also don't buy into the idea that Greek idea has only flowed northward, right? There's something about water and gravity, they tend to go south. And so the Mediterranean basin, right? If you are Christian, you just have to learn to know about St. Augustine. But from there, all the way to when Timbuktu was created, Al-Kunti and etc., what is happening? You can think, all the debate about the human condition that are happening in Greece, right, are taking place in Africa too. And sometimes much longer than they were taken up in Europe. So the idea that Greek is European is actually, I actually don't buy that either. I accept the idea that it was Mediterranean because I see different connection. And so what is involved here too is geography, right? How we have made geography speak to empire, support empire in some ways. And the relationship between geography and the canon. Because that's not actually true, right? You can just take any text, right? And so that's actually part of my project. So what I was doing there is actually to talk about the archives that they are constituted, which actually doesn't make sense at all. And yes, you are very right that I too marked that as the time when you saw there about natural law, nature, when nature and society, when it became possible to separate them as two different entities and to cast the non-West into nature and etc. I actually say that, but not in a complimentary sort of way. It is actually one of those tragedies of how we thought about the human, and it is implicated in the human question. Whether first that division was desirable, whether it actually is accurate, factual, what is nature, what is, I don't know. And so that is also complicated, right? And it's complicated by the fact that there were people who had, there were forms of life on this planet at the time when those notions were, those concepts were being formulated, to whom our separation from nature was both artificial and ill-founded, right? The New World, indigenous population of the New World in Africa and etc. And their thought about the ill-foundedness of that has actually come to have come to pass, right? And I want to take those as a critique, right? Because we always imagine that those critiques were not there, and things that happen naturally, and that actually is my. This is also one of my suspicions about this entire post-Anthropocene stuff, right? The idea that reason can be its own critique, or that nobody else can supplement all of the aporias in our thought, and that our only reaction is to respond to how the West conceive of the world and what happened to that trajectory. And that too is suspicious, right? I have the same suspicion about big data today, and I can tell you that later. But it's all the same thing. We are still, the same thing is being circulated and up on those grounds, and they're actually not valid to me. And so that's one of them. But I use them advisedly. Actually, it's not affirmatively. It's a sort of critique. Yes?
I would like for you to talk more about the Republic of America, because the way you set up the talk itself as that or at least your ideas at the beginning, that you want to go beyond this culture of critique, or stop at that, or complain. I feel it will help if you say a few words about the Republic of America. How is it? How do you set it up, or how do you, or how are you using it within this project as a counter narrative to this, or the idea of moving beyond? Because Haiti is a bit well known in terms of in the West through the work of Trio, Susan McMorris of Cornell, and so forth, of how it is it problematized Western modernity and it inverts it and so forth. Palmares.
When I was talking about integrals earlier, I was talking about how we begin to think about the world, about culture, about spaces, about ideas, about their circulation, about economies, morality, and all those, right? And they always proceed from one route, and then we trace them. And so what I wanted to do was actually talk about being otherwise modern. And I use that very deliberately. I don't like this idea of counter, because it was not always counter. Some of them actually embraced modernity completely, but made different things of it. And I also wanted to talk about universalism differently, right? And I start with universalism, then I go to Palmares. Just imagine when we didn't have national IDs, people did not have addresses, people were not very familiar with one another. Just imagine how trade happened from what we now call the Middle East to China, including North Africa, right? You imagine how people communicated. People had exchanges, right? And so if you imagine how that proceeds, universal actually began to appear very differently, because people had a general sense of equity, of whatever. The density was different from different places. People actually knew about risk, and people knew how to organize risk. People wanted, and all of those you can see. If you just take that as a predicate, that trade happened from here to there and they were all different, what happened? And then you begin to understand the institutions that emerged around them. Letter of credit happened straight to Malacca, long before the West even got in there, right? If you take the caravanserais, our hotel, our cafe culture, all of those happen as management of risk. Not necessarily being hospitable, but actually be both afraid, welcoming the stranger and being afraid of them, right? And I write about all of those because I actually want to talk about hospitality at some level without having to talk about Kant or, God forbid, Derrida. Right? Because that actually is much richer to think about hospitality in that context. Right? And actually, so there's a lot of recuperative stuff there. It's the same thing for Palmares. I want to talk about Palmares because Palmares was constituted along different axes of understanding the Republic. Public spaces, right? It does many things for me. The first one, obviously, is all of this stuff about humanitarianism, you know, laws against torture, against whatever. When Palmares was outlawing torture, Francis Bacon, the father of Western empiricism, was the commissioner of torture. You can Google that in England. Right? So violence, the economy of violence, how it operated, functions very differently. And there's a reason why people were enslaved, thought about it very differently. Right? And actually, Palmares actually write for me too about Africans who say that these things about civil rights and etc. are European ideas. Europe knows nothing about that tradition actually, which is very important. It appeared differently, right? And so this is the idea. What I want to say is that with modern economies, capital, the state, and etc., people begin to both experience and imagine the amount of violence it took to create order. And everybody responded to it in a different fashion. And so did slaves. In fact, the first person who said, "You shall never beat me again, sir," was not the slave owner, it was probably the slave. We can establish that. Right? And so I want to talk about the economy of both space and violence, right? In relation to order, which is what our obsession is in international relations, right? And I want to establish how those things come about, right? But the reason I wanted to write this book is that by the finish time, I don't want somebody to tell me, but was Palmares really a state? Because that actually is an insult, and I wanted to get rid of that so nobody has to insult me again. Right? Palmares was created a year after the Dutch Republic. Though they did not know about the Dutch republics, they actually expressed their will to independence in the same phraseology as the Dutch. We accept the principle that the Dutch had declared independence from Spain. We don't accept the premise that Palmares had declared independence from the Portuguese. Even though this time also happens with the time when Spain takes over Portugal, Portugal loses power, and so it opened the window for Palmares to have relationships with the Dutch, to have treaties and etc. For 70 years before the Republic of, before the monarchy in Spain in Portugal was re-established, right? So there's this entire space of political experimentation we don't want to think about. There's that. The other part has to do actually with the fact that I wanted to draw a genealogy from there to today about the idea of civil right. There's something in the idea of civil right that has nothing to do with modern constitutional debate, that has to do with the human, with the integrity of the body, with allowing for desires, with permissiveness, allowing people to be permissive, and etc. And I extend that even to sexuality. All of those happen in the context of political orders, very well regulated political orders. So I want to talk about that because when we talk about order, we always imagine it to be both limiting and restrictive in the manner in which we receive from Western Constitution. And I want a different genealogy because there is a different one. So I wanted to put that, pardon me?
No, I'm going to say, I was just thinking of indigenous studies,
Yeah.
which has a completely different genealogy than a Western genealogy.
That is true. What I would say that the reason I wanted to write this way is actually that I wanted to put it on a par with competing orders, right? Because these people, Palmares, there is actually a tandem there. They exist at the same time as the Dutch, but they were able to conceive of human faculties and the incorporation of that as freedoms in a manner that were very different from the Dutch. Palmares actually was the first colony, first republic, I should say, to have decided that white and black were equal, so were women and men. Right? And what that does, obviously, in anti-colonial struggles also, the import of that to anti-colonial struggle is also important to me. Right? And so all of this for me is a way of rethinking possibilities. But I'm rethinking possibilities alongside the plausible, not just speculation. Right? The plausible things that actually happen, that emanated in particular context. And I want to make that very distinction of the plausible because it's to guard against people who think that utopias are unfounded. But utopias are not actually unfounded. Just as in the West, they were founded on the plausible, we can actually imagine different orders alongside the plausible. But those have to be available to us, not as ethnographic data, which is actually what I'm resisting, not as ethnographic data, but as institutions from which we can make abstraction in the same way that the West did abstraction from the Greeks and the Romans, and we can make abstraction from them. We have to allow for ourselves to make abstraction for what anthropologists have now coded as ethnographic fact. Right? So I'm actually, there's a very not so subtle critique of anthropology and what they have done to knowledge, generally, of modernity, and in creating certain facts. But the world has never operated on fact, in fact. He was there, and then I'll go to, yeah, please.
Sure.
Then I'll go to Shira.
I was wondering how you deal with the question of translation, because different terms in different contexts, like how I guess you equate them, or what rather this idea of identity versus difference between these terms could be more of an obsession that should be gotten rid of, and in favor of discerning resemblances and the idea of things that are whether you think identity and difference between these terms are a problem or whether it's a productive kind of
What terms?
different terms in different languages, for example, or different contexts, for example, whether that is more of a hindrance or whether that's a productive line of thinking.
It's actually that has occurred to me, and I understand my limitation because I'm not dealing really with Asia, because I know this the New World, Africa and Europe. But even then, one can think first about the context translation, whether it's strictly linguistic or whether it can also be symbolic, as in, say, Chinese script can be used by people who don't speak Chinese, and that's okay, you can translate. So transactions can happen differently. But one of the people actually whose book I've been mining a lot about translation is not so much about translation, but it's about this idea of comparison without equivalencies. Is by Natalie, from Natalie, right? Yes.
Yes.
Right? It's this idea, because translation doesn't require, comparison and translation don't require equivalencies in the way that we imagine it. Because they don't, right? If, again, speak of translation, the Silk Road actually plays a very good part in this, right? When people left the Middle East and went to China, either via North Africa or the land of the Mongols, whatever the trajectory was, right? People were actually able to function, right? But people did not desire the same thing. Desires have never the same. People don't desire the same thing, and things don't have the same equivalencies for people. They don't have even have the same value. The only thing that matters is that they want to transact, right? And so, and the reason I actually use that setup to talk about that is that I have a very difficult problem with, we talk these days about incommensurability and etc., etc. One has to actually use that with a little bit, right? And those transactions actually is properly managed, had very good effect. For instance, in the Ottoman Empire, people did not want foreigners to come into their homes. So they began to build compounds with two sides, with an internal wall. Today, conservative Muslims think that was meant to keep the women back and veiled. But it was actually meant to manage, in some places, some instances, and there's ample evidence of that, manage risk. You can be killed, but the family will be protected, or they have the land. And then we move from that to the caravanserais, and we move from the caravanserais to having these things that become cafes. So all our industry of hospitality today actually has its origin in that. But it was people who could not understand one another, didn't know what other people wanted, and therefore had both to recognize that they needed to transact, because the economy had to function in a certain way, but also needed to manage risk, right? And they built up those things. They didn't have to speak your language. You didn't have to indoctrinate them. You didn't even have to have the same God, but you could transact with them, right? And so translation, and that's the thing. If you think of the universal, not as spectral, as something that resonates, right? That it has an idea to which everybody that can make sense to everybody, and that allows transaction with multiple entities, but that has different resonances in different places, with different densities and etc. If you imagine universal, of course you have universal value. But if you universal as authoritative, uniform, and etc., that's what you have when you have the international order of the state, right? Which is the particular way of thinking about order than what existed before. So currency emerges in that context too. There's a lot of things that emerge in that context. So actually, there's a whole. I want to subscribe to a different idea of the universal. Universal simply meant as understood by people across regions, not something that is dictated, right? Because that's not how norms have evolved historically. That happens only under new. Anyway, so Palmares is actually involved in a lot of those discussions about what kind of order do we aspire to, and did the global order need to be cast in the way that it is, with its exclusions, and which also brings me back to the idea of identity. Our modern identities, we should actually just take them to be modern identities, especially those that emerge after the state. Before that, it's more complicated than that. Yes, sure.
I wanted to go back to the question of Haiti for a second, because just to sort of provide for myself, and maybe you can do that too, of a different genealogy, one that would go from Palmares to Haiti, is what I would be interested in hearing from you, as opposed to thinking of the Haitian, what happened in Haiti is often described, yes, as a revolution, but also as a slave rebellion, successful slave rebellion. They're not the same thing.
They're not the same thing.
And so the way in which Haiti has almost become, sort of enfolded into the revolutions of the 18th century, 19th century, gives us one sort of a paradigm, perhaps the one that you're critiquing itself. Now Haiti gets to join, with the others, as opposed to, if you can establish a genealogy between Palmares and Haiti, I would like to hear it.
That's a vast question. But I want to say,
as an alternative,
Yeah.
it may not work,
No.
but as a possibility
it
for
is.
a different sort of reading of what happened in Haiti.
And I think the way I would answer that just briefly, because it's such a vast topic, the way I would answer that briefly is to say that you don't need the state to have the republic, which is why I like Thoreau's other book, The State Against Nation. You don't need the state to have a republic. The republic is a different way, has a different lineage, different trajectory than the state, right? And so in that context, I actually am very reluctant to think of Haiti as one of those Enlightenment revolutions and etc. And I think of it as slave rebellion in part because enslavement was actually the problem. And if you think of it that way, obviously some of the mistakes of the revolution later, so-called, you can understand them. But the struggle against enslavement for me is much more important because everything we have to wrestle with, most of the things we have to wrestle with, have to do with certain kind. A lot of our oppressive structures have echoes of enslavement, which is why, you know, slaves, white slaves, sex trafficking, slavery, it always comes up, Mauritanian slavery, etc. Because it has to be against going the senses and sensibilities. It also has to do with trapping bodies, faculties into certain grades, right? That can also be seen in the kind of archives I was talking about, in those grades. And so I actually like to think about it as a slavery, even Palmares. Because Palmares, the path to the Republic was actually the easy one. The most difficult one was actually, as we see today, enslavement. For instance, in the idea that we are unable even today to accept the idea that what Jefferson said in that thing we have it framed in Philadelphia, that it has been said by slaves in Palmares 2 centuries earlier. And they had done so without accepting the idea of slavery, without accepting the gender differentiation, without accepting that divorce disqualified people, without accepting that children were inferior, without accepting that that they were racist, right? And one of the achievements of Palmares actually in the fact that it was so integrated is that today, and this is a fact, the Brazilian government wants to know how many native population lived on the western coast of Brazil. And they couldn't because many of them had died out. So a doctor came up with the idea of actually taking the DNAs of the remnants of Palmares to figure that out because they actually incorporated native population. It was their own was to incorporate natives, the Dutch. Everybody was part of this space. And how they did that was actually quite phenomenal. And that's one of the legacies that you cannot tell somebody today from Palmares whether they were Indians, Dutch, or etc., etc. You actually, and so they help people figure out how many the different population of native indigenous people in Brazil by taking the blood of these seemingly black people to figure out, right? So it was both institutional, but it was actually lived very radically. But the whole problem was not having any oppressive structure that reminded them of slavery, and the slavery was actually for them the light against which they were running, right? And so they saw even discrimination as a form of slavery, which is why, right, and that you can tell that from the relationship with the Dutch and to native population around them, and also among themselves and how they structured themselves. So yes, I don't want to, because if you start talking about Haiti as one of the revolution of the 18th century, then you start to code it differently, you start to see the constitution differently, and then some things become anomaly. But they are not anomalies, they are actually consistent with a particular way of understanding space, labor, value, the human, social organizations, and etc., which comes from different traditions.
And the experience of slavery.
And experience of slavery, of course, that's right. Yeah. Yes.
So I have a question about, so you touched upon your use of universalism or universality, by which you obviously don't mean the European universalism, but a different kind. And I wanted to ask you about similarly about your conception of difference or otherness, because you were, so you referred to Femi's metaphysics of otherness,
of difference.
Yeah. So there's an essential othering there, which is obviously political and I would even say racist, right? But there is also mode of identification or assumption of sameness that is not like recognizing a fellow human. So if I go philosophical and I think about the other in Western philosophy, when we approach an other, that is a part of conceiving them as human. So I'm interested in what you have to say about that imagination of, on the one hand, this is a complete other. On the other hand, we can travel into Africa and see ourselves many years ago, right? We have this. It's as if Africa is swallowed by this identificatory imagination, right? We can go back in time and see how we were, and it's actually just a mirror there. So how do you, between these conceptions of sameness and otherness and universalism that comes out of assuming that the other is like the self versus universalism that takes into account the other, is this weird? Okay.
No, you are right, because one of the things one of the things that actually I'm interested in when I was talking about archives and algorithm is to see what monetism did about how we understand identities.
Mm-hmm.
Because in monetism there is the possibility of the doom, right? Doomed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a form, those exist in monetism, but in many other religions, different functions differently. One of the things I like to tell undergraduates when I teach them is that we think with the rudimentary thing I know about India is to say them that what I like about Hinduism is that some of the gods are mischievous, some of them are mean, some of them are happy, some of them are whatever, and you don't, right? You go along with your gods, whatever compels you. But I said that as a joke, but it's actually true of many places. So the idea of radical differences, permanent lines of differentiation, etc., comes from monetism and was inherited in many ways by modern philosophy, but it's not actually how the world functions in many places. Which is actually one of the paradoxes of Africa, people say, is that after they had empires, they had colonies, they had everything else, before Europeans and after Europeans, and etc., but they still speak nearly 4,000 languages, because nobody ever said, you must speak my language. Which I think is what Toni Morrison was referring to in her Nobel acceptance speech when you said, who said the Tower of Babel collapsed because they spoke many languages? Was it because they spoke many languages, or somebody said my language or else? You can imagine why the tower collapsed, right? We don't imagine that the tower did not collapse because there were many languages. The tower collapsed because somebody said mine or else, right? And I prefer that formulation because where you don't have monetism, difference appears differently along different axes than it did in Europe, and they are less permanent in a very happy sort of way. Most of the time. Yeah. Yes, please.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. And I also want to talk a little bit more about the universal. Sorry I'm belaboring it, but in some ways, what I understand from your talk is you're trying to locate spaces that are, when you phrase it otherwise, in terms of modernity, in terms of human, in terms of universal.
Yeah.
Right? So when you talk about the universal that we have inherited from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment and so forth, I fully get your critique. Then when you want your move to go to a space that is otherwise, to think about the human and the universal, as an anthropologist, I guess I'm approaching this in that, so every community or historical period has a sense of the universal or the human.
Yeah.
It seems so based like in some ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
What the Enlightenment kind of universal had a certain punch because it came at a particular historical moment that combined the discovery of the New World, and something happened in knowledge where science not going to have the punch. I don't know if I'm making sense here. It's like, basically I'm asking you, how do you operationalize a universal? Even though you can locate it in Palmyra or in Haiti, it happened in terms of, yes, you know, the freedom, the human freedom that they, Poussin defined was way more encompassing.
Yeah.
But how do you operationalize a universal from a space that is otherwise?
Yeah, I think that one of the, I want to say two things. One, there's a way to think about universalism before humanism, before the appearance of humanism as an intellectual movement, and then after it, because those two universalisms, even in Europe, have different valences, and I want to allow for that. The other part actually has to do with the fact that with what universalism did, as you said, the punch, right? And I actually think that one of the tragedies of the modern world is that it came with that punch, because universalism is not so much about authority, which is what it gave the West, right? Authority to regulate, it has a regulatory function, and everybody has to march in certain ways. It has an ordering function, which universalism did not have. Universalism actually is about people relating in transactions, comprehending the same thing, and understanding the theology of transaction to be the same. And so you can be Muslim, you buy your kola nut, do whatever you want to do with it. If my grandmother bought a kola nut, she used it to predict the future. And everybody used kola nut, but they used it for different people, and nobody cared, in fact. Right? It's the same thing with what you did, right? How you consumed, and what you consumed. Right? Again, I was talking about monotheism earlier. Even at the beginning of monotheism, right? Christianity, Islam, there are many variants of them. They didn't become what they are today, at least for Christianity, until the fourth Pope, Clementine. And then we had the Ecclesia, and then everything changes. But before that, it was actually much more, shall we say, looser on the edges. Right? But that's looseness actually in the area of universalism, that you can actually have the same ideas, aspire to the same thing, have the same institution, but the end to which you put your ideas, how you consume, distributive functions, all of those may differ even within that, should be okay. Right? And so universalism for me has to do something else. That punch is what I want to avoid, because that was the problem in universalism. That was the germ of violence that never left, and that is what led us to the Encomendians. That's what led to the camp, to the plantation, to the camp, the death camps, to all of those. They actually have to do with that, right? Because it was asserting the supremacy of the one, right? And that comes, there's actually a lineage between that and monotheism in a certain fashion. But that is the one I want to get rid of, because we don't, actually the world can do without that punch. Yeah. Yes, Peter.
Siba, so I'm trying to understand the nature of the enterprise. It's not a question, it's an intuition. When I hear you talk, I have the image of a butterfly landing on lots of interesting flowers in a very rich garden, not landing for a long time, but taking off very soon. And you do that because you want to take care of the whole garden. My intuition, what I would do with that ambition, I would say I want to take the two dimensions of time and space. I came to the talk because of the intriguing title. When time came up on your thing, that's the one thing which you didn't talk about, you just went right past it. The history of the future is a very captivating title. When you talk about space, by the way, it's utterly plausible, commonsensical, and you know what you're talking about. With the flowers, I'm not so sure. So what about the history of the future? I thought you were going to talk about quantum physics. No, it's not a joke.
No, it's not. I'm laughing because it's so true.
The act of measurement is when the infinity of multiverses collapses into the world we know. That gives you an enormous license to make the argument which you want to make. Okay. Once the physicist measures, there's no disagreement. They take the data, they say it's experimentally proven. 100 years later, they don't know what it means. Once a social scientist or international relations scholar measures, they go to the next measurement, and that's when the argument starts. So I think in order to reduce your complexity, if you were to say, I'd stick with the title and develop this idea of infinite possibilities in the past and unpredictability of the future, but with the act of measurement we create the world in which we live, you could simplify your task, visit fewer flowers, and do it in 2 chapters. What you're doing cannot be done in 2 chapters. I don't think it can be done in 20 books.
Yes, actually, thank you. I'll use that formulation because I actually like it. Thank you very much. You just gave me an idea. And I hope Tim is writing it down. No, the history of the future is this. It is actually along the axis of finite and infinite, because I actually know that the possibilities that we have imagined in the modern era, that everything is finite, things that are finite, our concept of order, our conception of this, of that, and etc., even the universal and what operates in them, that they are finite. And I actually want to make an argument for infinitude. In fact, when I was talking about, I passed it very rapidly. And I want to do that. And I actually want to, I laugh because I'm struggling now with quantum physics, in fact, which is why I laugh. It was not a joke. I hope you didn't hear it that way. So, because I'm actually struggling with it, and I'm stumbling around that. But what I want to talk about, when I said the history of the future, I was very clear about it, that the moment we are in, and the way in which we are going to extract ourselves from it, is going to be not unlike what happened during the Renaissance and at the onset of the Enlightenment. That this is part of that project. It is to basically discredit science and the disciplines that they are today because they no longer function, and to take from that, in that process, take from it what can happen and make an infinite number of propositions from which that allow us to think about the future. That future, its history is being written today because, and we do it in multiple ways. For some people it's just criticizing Eurocentrism, blah, blah, blah. So some people it's the limit of democracy. So some people post-anthroposophy. Everybody, but what is unquestionable now is that our institutions, our systems of thought, and etc., that we are recognizing that they have come to a point where they either no longer serve us or they have reached certain limits. And we need to think ourselves beyond them. And that future is going to know, it's still past, which is what sometimes actually is a genealogy of the present and a history as a history of the future, because we are making the future now. And we have to say, before people begin to think that nihilism is what awaits us, or different versions of affective states is what we can only hope for, or that Western science can be a critique of itself and that's a way to salvation. Before we say all of that stuff, I actually want to talk about a proposition we made to ourselves. That in creating these spaces along the edge of the discipline, we actually thought that they would contribute to something, which was actually to either to allow us to rethink our epistemologies, ontologies, and all of things, method, and all of things we think. And I actually want to do that. And I actually think that is very coherent to me. And I was actually, and that comment actually will make me want to sharpen certain things. It's a very coherent thing for me. But before I get there, I actually have to show why what we have is incoherent. And it's not just a critique, an old form of critique. It actually is that if we know how it was assembled, the reassembly will not be a problem. Because I don't want somebody to think that the utopic moment here is just whimsical. What we had. Right? And that is what I want to take out of this book. I don't want people to think that utopia is either a bad thing or that is a whimsical moment, because it's actually grounded in how things, the new world came about, how the present was constituted, and what is not working with it. But what is the predicate upon which it was built were actually not necessarily erroneous. The idea of humanism, of universalism, of all of those were not necessarily, because that's how the world functioned. I was just told that every entity thinks about human entities beyond them. Everybody has an idea of the universe, and etc., etc. So it's not that we don't have, all those are not possible. It is that the manner in which they were constituted are very, very highly problematic. And to actually talk productively about that, we actually have to see how this was assembled and why it was so erroneously assembled. And so I actually don't agree that one of the problems, obviously, I agree with you that the social sciences you measure, it only opens the debate the next day, of course. But some of it is that we actually have to have, there are things around which, since I was talking about facts, evidence, and proof, some things have been so evidently proven that we don't actually need to question them anymore. Right? And so when I teach in my classes, the first chapter actually, the first line is, there was never any treaties in the New World. Because a treaty is not possible with somebody whose will you think is inferior. So all of the document we gave Native Americans was actually forged. It was not. We have to agree on those things so we can actually look at the past. There are some things that are just be proven. In our own genealogies, there's no treaty with somebody whose will you think is inferior. That is just that. We should just let that go. And so that part of, for me, is the measurement, is to establish first fact, to establish evidence, to establish how we can prove them to be fact. And I'm using fact very loosely here because I understand that they are social facts. But some things have to be evident. The reason that we seem to be spread, we still seem to think whether colonialism can be redeemed. No, Africa did not collapse under its own weight. Can we just take that home and go? Because they had kingdoms, they had empires, they had institutions, they sold gold. Mansa Musa was as big, at least imagined himself to be as big as Alexander. Augustine was African. Simon of Cyrene, who helped Jesus Christ carry his cross, was from Libya. We have been part of this universe. Can we just leave that and go home and not want to justify the unjustifiable? But it's not just to denounce it as unjustifiable, it's actually to say how it was made to be so unjustifiable in order to, at the point of reassembly, and I actually believe in infinity. There are multiple ways of reassembling it, and I just want to show one way in which we can do it by going through Africa and the African descended diasporas and etc. But that is actually part of the things that we ought to be doing, right? And just as an aside, my friend here, actually, Girard, I came to him one day, I was very excited because I had not realized that Bernard Chan was from Trinidad. Now, when Sun Yat-sen had the revolution in 1911, he wanted to understand empire, and he sent for the Chinese diaspora. Who gets there? It's an Afro-Chinese who goes to advise him on how to write all the cultural documents of China. Black people have traveled, Pan-Africanism travels. We have helped make the world. China invited a Pan-Africanist to go imagine, to give them a critique of empire, and then to create the first two cultural magazines of the revolution. And so when I'm talking about infinity, I actually want to allow for all those abstractions. And the reason the flowers are so many is precisely because they are infinite. But I'm going to bring a lot of them together. I'm not going to get the whole garden, but I'm going to pluck the ones that come from Africa and to show how a critique and alternative may be provided for the manner in which international relations thinks about the world.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for working on